stories, but I'm sure you're very interested in hearing out this interview. We just had Ravneet Gill in the studio a short while back, all about the board meet, the first reaction coming in person after the board meet concluded yesterday. Let's listen in as to what he had to tell Nikunj.
The board meeting, very clearly we deliberated what the options were on the table. The most advanced obviously was Citax. Given the fact that this was a preferential allotment, the board's considered view was that let's complete all the formalities before we give the final approval and make the preferential allotment, which I think from a process standpoint is exactly the right thing to do. And that is what the message was supposed to convey. I don't think that the message in any way conveys any uncertainty around this $500 million. All that it said was that we are considering this favorably and we will approve it. But I think the question really was that let's complete the overall formalities and the documentation before we go ahead and do that. So I feel very, very strongly certain about the $500 million being there. All our conversations with the investor have suggested that. The investor has, very clearly demonstrated to us through a lot of documentation in terms of, the availability of money, the fact that this investment is getting liquidated to be able to put into an escrow account for the final investment in NES Bank. And also given the background of the investor, I personally think that, Reserve Bank of India will look at it very favorably.
The big question is that before the board meeting, when we spoke last, on 30th, you had indicated to the markets that you had in principle offers of $2 billion. There is no mention on the $1.2 billion bid of Arvind Singh Bridge. You've said that the board is still considering it.
That's right.
So when you say board is still considering it, do you think there are some concerns which the board members have raised about the bid and the quality of the bid and from where it is originating? I think that's the biggest question. Why is the $1.2 billion bid still under consideration?
So, a couple of things. First and foremost, even if you saw the release that we made to the exchanges post the last board meeting, we have said that negotiations are on, which should get concluded shortly. The investor is domiciled in Canada, has businesses across the world, hasn't invested big numbers in India, and to that extent, there was a lot of due diligence that needed to get done. Both sides needed to be totally certain about, wanting to enter into this engagement. And given the fact that this was a multi-jurisdictional investor, we wanted to be completely sure that there was alignment of interests, because this is not like a public markets investor coming in. If you're getting into a preferential allotment, I think the relationship that defines between the investor and the bank is of a completely different nature. I mean, the contours of that relationship are very different. So all that we want to do is that, want to satisfy ourselves completely in every respect before taking a final call. And I think while I can understand the impatience of the market in this respect, I would much rather that we take a very considered, well thought through view on in the matter rather than, do something in haste either way and then subsequently realize that maybe it was not the right decision to make.
Since this is a binding bid, I'm sure Arvind Singh Bridge would have done his due diligence when you gave a binding bid. You have got this bid, I think the bid came to you by end of October.
That's it.
It's been a good 45 days after that.
Yes.
45 days is a long time at a time when there's an urgent need to raise capital.
Right.
Why is the due diligence process from your side taking so long, and what are the concerns the board members yesterday raised about this bid?
So 45 days may look like a fairly long period. I mean, do bear in mind, Nikunj, that we want to raise capital very quickly. We understand that, what the market's expectations in this regard are, the pressures that come with that. Question is that should we allow that to hurry us into a decision? At the end of the day, don't look at it in the context of a 45-day due diligence. Look at it in the context of a relationship then that which is there for a very long period of time, right? With potential board representation, etc. You would want that relationship to work well and to be sustainable. And I think if to be able to establish those principles, it takes a little bit of time. I would much rather do that than for either side to, repent at leisure. So we have always maintained that, any recommendation that we will make to the board will have to be very well diligenced. It will have to be very well thought through, must make complete strategic and financial sense for the bank. And I think that's the process that is underway. So while I can understand in some respects the impatience of the market, and I apologize for that, equally I feel that, these are decisions which can be life-altering and should be, very well thought through.
So if you have to, let's say, talk about the bid in terms of the status, is it still work in progress or you think it may actually not see light of the day given where your due diligence process is?
So I would say that
It's not off the table.
it's not off the table, and I think if it was off the table, I think the board would have very candidly mentioned that in yesterday's release. As it says, discussions are still on, and which is exactly the status. So we haven't been able to reach a conclusion on this particular bid.
Not able to conclude.
As I mentioned to you that there is certain due diligence that is currently underway. There were certain representations, etc., that we needed, and as soon as those get fully addressed, we will be in a position to take a final decision.
In your board meeting, there was also mention of Rakesh Jhunjhunwala,
Yes.
a mention of GMR family office, Aditya Birla family office.
Yes.
In yesterday's board meeting, there was no mention of bidders and what is the status on those bids?
So two things here. First and foremost, as far as the Indian family offices are concerned, we spoke with them and we said that potentially let this capital raise go ahead, and then in the next raise they could come in. That was a view that we shared with them, and I have to say they were very supportive and very understanding in the matter. The second is, as far as some of the institutional bids were concerned, I think those were conditional upon us raising a certain number in one shot. And given the fact that we were not raising that number in yesterday's board meeting, we thought it would be inappropriate to discuss those bids.
So are those bids off the table?
No, they are not off the table. I just think that once we have the numbers, overall number, which we talked about, I think then they will be back in play.
So what would you say is in the final lap? It's the $500 million bid which is in the final lap.
No, so I won't say that. So first and foremost, two things. If you see 500 in isolation, it's not a small number. Even 500 million will add 1.1% to our CET1. So it's not an insignificant number. And we have shown over the last couple of quarters the ability of the bank to be able to accrue capital organically. So that process will continue. We will continue to run the balance sheet in a very efficient fashion, while wanting to raise the full capital that we need and we require. But equally, Nikunj, what was also discussed in yesterday's board meeting were a couple of other offers, bids, expressions of interest that we are currently considering. And as any responsible board would be, we will be in a position to come out and disclose those to the market as soon as they become binding, and that process could be very short. So the single message that I would want to convey to the markets, to investors, to depositors, is that our fundraise is very much on track. We have a plan B, we have a plan C. It's just a question of the fact that we would want to disclose that in greater detail once we have binding bids on the table. But just the mere fact that we talked about 500 million in yesterday's board meeting should not in any way convey the impression that we are not trying to solve for a smaller size.
But the board understands the urgency of capital.
Yes.
Why board yesterday did not take a firm and a final decision on the $500 million bid?
So just to be able to put that into context, yesterday evening post the board meeting, the investor wrote to us saying that will be very shortly conveying to us the details of the escrow, and will be also going and approaching the Reserve Bank of India for their approval. So as you are aware, the process is that if there's an investor who's over 5% and which requires regulatory approval, then the bank doesn't approach the RBI on their behalf, they approach the Reserve Bank of India directly. So yesterday, immediately after the board meeting, the investor wrote to us thanking the board for favorable consideration of his bid, saying that they will very shortly be conveying the details around the escrow, and that they will be putting in the Reserve Bank of India application. I think that shows their preparedness and their commitment to this particular investment.
What is next? What should we expect from the next board meeting of Yes Bank?
So I think what you can expect from the next meeting of the board meeting of Yes Bank is much more clarity on the overall size of capital that we are raising. And potentially a closure of a couple of investment transactions.
So when should we expect the next board meeting?
So one of the things which I will say is that we got the timing of the board meeting yesterday wrong. The way matters were progressing, we thought that we will have all the procedures, etc., completed before the board meeting, which wasn't quite the case. And I admit to that, absolutely. So we don't want to just put ourselves in that bind, but the clear intention of the board, and which was also articulated in the board meeting yesterday, was that the board will meet ASAP and at very short notice as soon as we are ready to print.
Which means 2019 or early 2020?
No, very much so, 2019 itself.
So 2019, the next board meeting will happen, and in that board meeting, we will get a complete clarity
Yes.
on how much capital you are raising.